Hi there, I'm Dr. Christie Solomon, and we welcome you to continue studying in our Women in the Bible series. This week and this entire month, we've had 4 sessions on the study of Ruth, and they covered the 4 chapters that are included in that book. Again, I trust that you remember that there are only 2 books named after women in our Bible. Both of them are in the Old Testament. Of course, we are introduced to the main character and follow the narrative of Ruth and her people, as well as the book of Esther in the Old Testament, also engaged in their interaction and how God has provided some divine providence in their storyline as well. So let me just ask you a question. Let's think about this. When someone says to you, "Let me tell you about my mother-in-law," do you expect some kind of negative statement or a humorous anecdote? Because the mother-in-law character has been a standard centerpiece of ridicule and comedy for dozens of years. Oh, you might have laughed at a joke once or twice. In this book, however, of Ruth tells a different story. Because Ruth loved her mother-in-law, Naomi. And when we meet them, they're both recently widowed, Ruth and Naomi. And when Naomi prepares to go back to Israel, to Bethlehem, in fact, Ruth begs to stay with Naomi wherever she went, even though it would mean leaving her homeland of Moab. And in fact, we read about the emotion and the passion and the commitment that Ruth is expressing when she says, "Your people will be my people, and your God, my God." That's said in chapter 1. But I'm wondering if she understood that 3 chapters later, however many years that transpired, actually she would be included in this family line where their people, their God, our God, actually would be her God. That might have been foreshadowing, and that's used a lot in narratives. But this is what's going on in this book, and as well as we read about the story of God's grace in the midst of difficult circumstances. There was a famine. You guys remember we meet them in chapter 1, and they have come to Moab from Bethlehem because of the famine. There is no food for them to be able to have access to. So Ruth's story occurred during the time of the Judges, a period of disobedience, idolatry, and even violence for the people of Israel and others around. But even in those times of crisis and displays of desperate despair, there are those people, there's always a remnant who follow God and through whom God worked. And that's what we read about in chapter 4, how God is working. Not just in chapter 4, throughout these 4 chapters, but specifically, we're on chapter 4, and we're again seeing how the hand of God is moving. So no matter how discouraging or antagonistic the world may seem, and it is just not friendly, it is just that dark, there are always people, you and I, who follow God, regardless of the circumstances. Regardless of COVID, regardless of the RSV, regardless of the wars, we still claim and demonstrate that we love God enough to continue to be obedient. So we read here that God chooses to use a woman who was not even from the family of the Jewish nation. She was not Hebrew. She was a Moabite. And he chooses to do so all throughout the Bible, and in fact, still doing so in the 21st century. But he does that with those who are open to him and to achieve his purposes. You don't have to know what he's going to do, because that's God's divine providence and its will. But are you open to let him use you in those ways and receive this bountiful blessing that Ruth receives in this chapter? She was a Moabitess, and Boaz was a descendant of Rahab, who was actually a former prostitute when she lived in Jericho. Nevertheless, their offspring continued the family line through which the Messiah came into our world. So we've learned about their history of who it was included in the family, you know, the good relatives and the bad relatives, all the way down till we get to Ruth, who marries Boaz. In chapter 4, that's what's happening. She marries Boaz, and as time goes on, they do have a son, and that son is Obed, who becomes the father of David, King David, yeah, that same one, and through his lineage, then the expected Messiah, our Jesus Christ, comes into the world. So, as you read this book, you're going to see several themes that are continuing to be evident in this chapter because these themes are important and they are universal for you to identify and notice throughout your daily faith journey. Again, one is faithfulness. Ruth's faithfulness to Naomi as a daughter-in-law and a friend is a great example of love and loyalty. Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz are also faithful to God and his laws. We read that in chapter 4. Throughout this story, we see God's faithfulness also to his people. So a second theme here is kindness. Ruth showed great kindness to Naomi. In turn, Boaz showed kindness to Ruth, a despised Moabite woman with no money. God showed his kindness to Ruth, to Naomi, and to Boaz by bringing them together again, for his purpose. His will be done. Let me say that again. Say that with me. God, your will be done. And then there's a third theme of integrity. Listen, my brother and my sister, you cannot demonstrate any character of God, made in the image of God, if you're not operating in integrity and truth. Ruth showed high moral character by being loyal to Naomi, by her clean break from her former land and customs back in Moab, and by her hard work in the field of Boaz. Boaz showed integrity in his moral standards, his honesty, and by following through on his commitments. And he didn't take Ruth in private at night to have his way, which he could have, but he did not, and he gave the utmost respect, as we read in chapter 3, sharing with her that he will fulfill this commitment if, in fact, he is able to be the kinsman redeemer. So that is his integrity, a man who took his word serious and lived on it. We also, of course, always find God's protection. We see God's care and protection over the lives of Naomi and Ruth, his supreme control over these circumstances. Listen, people, God is over, bigger, beyond any circumstance that arises in our daily life, and he brings them out of that area into safety and security. And of course, you remember, you can testify how he's guided you as well, your body, your mind, your spirit as well. And then theme number 5 that we see in this book as well as in chapter 4 that we're addressing. Ruth and Naomi came to Bethlehem as poor widows, but they soon became prosperous through Ruth's marriage to Boaz. Ruth became the great-grandmother of King David. The greatest blessing was not just the money, the marriage, or even the child that she had from Brother Boaz and the standard of living and the great reputation that they had in the community. But what was even more important for them as well as for us to remember is that there was a blessing of love that was demonstrated between Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. So consider those 5 things as you're reading chapter 4, and we will read the scriptures there, so these 22 verses, so that it will be clear for you and you can see how God is moving in these verses. We're reading from the NIV.
Ruth chapter 4. 1. Meanwhile, Boaz went to the gate and sat down there. Soon the kinsman redeemer of whom he had spoken came along, and Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. 2. Then Boaz took 10 of the elders of the city and said, "Sit here," and they did so. 3. And he said to the kinsman redeemer, "Naomi, who has returned from the land of Moab, is selling the piece of land that belonged to our brother Elimelech. For I thought I should inform you that you may buy it back in the presence of those seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you want to redeem it, do so. But if you will not redeem it, tell me so I may know, because there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you." "I will redeem it," he replied. 5. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi and also from Ruth the Moabitess, you must also acquire the widow of the deceased in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance." 6. The kinsman redeemer replied, "I cannot redeem it myself, or I would jeopardize my own inheritance. Take my right of redemption, because I cannot redeem it." 7. Now in former times in Israel, concerning the redemption or exchange of property, to make any matter legally binding, a man would remove his sandal and give it to the other party, and this was a confirmation in Israel. 8. So the kinsman redeemer removed his sandal and said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself." 9. At this, Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witnesses today that I am buying from Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. 10. Moreover, I have acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, to raise up the name of the deceased through his inheritance, so that his name will not disappear from among his brothers or from the gate of his home. You are witnesses today." 11. We are witnesses, said the elders and all the people at the gate. May the Lord make the woman entering your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you be prosperous in Ephrathah and famous in Bethlehem. 12. And may your house become like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring the Lord will give you by this young woman. 13. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he had relations with her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. 14. Then the woman said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a kinsman redeemer. May his name become famous in Israel. 15. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." 16. And Naomi took the child, placed him on her lap, and became a nurse to him. 17. The neighbor woman said, "A son has been born to Naomi," and they named him Obed. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. 18. Now these are the generations of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron. 19. Hezron was the father of Ram, Ram was the father of Amminadab. 20. Amminadab was the father of Nahshon. Nahshon was the father of Salmon. 21. Salmon was the father of Boaz, Boaz was the father of Obed. 22. Obed was the father of Jesse, and Jesse was the father of David.
So in the reading of these 22 verses of chapter 4, you were able to recognize some of the major themes that were shared in this chapter 4. You also had the opportunity to take notes for topics of discussion in your circle of influence about Ruth's loyalty, about Boaz's righteousness. Again, at the last few verses, we see the listing of the genealogy of King David, and you also learned about some of the social and religious laws of ancient Israel that they instituted way back in Leviticus, and they had the opportunity to bring one forward through the Levirate marriage law in this chapter. Some of the people that you read in this chapter is, of course, Ruth and Boaz and Naomi, but then there was an unnamed relative who was the closest kinsman to redeem the property that was part of Elimelech's estate that included Naomi. And although he's not mentioned, this shares with us the divine will of God, that he would not be the one that connected Naomi and Ruth, but in fact it would be Boaz. And there were the elders that were in the center of town, or the edge of town, where they were able to gather and have discussions and meet the traveling tradesmen and all who came through the gates. We are introduced to Perez, and then through that lineage we even read about King David's reign and him being part of that family. Again, we know that locations are in Bethlehem, this time at the town gate. But what we're saying here is, as we're bringing this chapter to a close, we can take note that in this last part of chapter 4, the final chapter, it definitely carries some historical and theological implications. Yes, think about it. This chapter centers on the resolution of a complex social and religious dilemma, which is, for them, the redemption of the deceased Elimelech's estate and Ruth's future through the form of this ancient Israelite marriage called the Levirate marriage. So this chapter also shares with us the establishment of the lineage of King David. As you read in the New Testament, they're always making sure that everyone knows how they're connected to being called Jewish or Hebrew or one of the 12 tribes of Judah. And that's always been foremost in that community still today. And they link themselves to one of these tribes that brings forth their presence in the Hebrew nation. And this is happening in chapter 4 as well. So we've ended this with a great understanding that shares with us some aspects about how God felt about using women, and even not notable women, as well as he does for men. In this case, chapter 4, Boaz was notable, had integrity, was a great businessman, was fair to his workers. He was compassionate. He looked out. He didn't try to cheat anyone. He went to the unnamed relative and presented the case there. He stood firm. All of those things that we're seeing, which are attributes that make him known as Boaz the man. Yeah, we do hear that women want a Boaz. Absolutely, they would want a Boaz, because Boaz has it going on, if we can say that contemporarily. But we also realize that that's not always the case. Women are not always portrayed positively, just as well as the storylines and the narratives of some of the men. Nevertheless, we continue to bless God that he allowed this narrative to be written down and shared with us so that we can see the bigger picture, of course, pointing to the Messiah, but even so, the loving kindness and the divine hand of God as he's working through this group of people for us to realize how much he loves all of us. And that's the storyline. So this is more than just a nice love story, but in fact, in reality, these are events that are part of Ruth's storyline, her narrative, that God prepares for the birth of David and of Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah. It's not just what is happening to Ruth and Naomi, but the bigger picture, the larger purpose that God is always preparing for to enlarge his kingdom. Listen, we trust that this lesson has been fruitful for you as we continue to study Women in the Bible. This series had 4 sessions, and we can make them available to you if you just email us at the address on the screen, ChristianConcepts at yahoo.com. We're glad that you studied with us again, and we pray that the peace and fulfilled promises of God meets you and your family at your door and envelops you until we are able to study with you the next time. So you be blessed.